colleague here started with China, and I'm going to also bridge NATO. I'm going to speak about the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a household name here. Canada is one of the founding members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or the Atlantic Alliance, through the Washington Treaty, signed in 1949 in Washington, D.C. That's why it's called formally the Washington Treaty. Informally, it's called the North Atlantic Treaty. But I'm going to start. He brought up Origi, and new hegemonic powers are a transfer between centers, or a shift between centers. Well, I want to start off with a quote from a man that many of us should know, Brzezinski, former U.S. National Security Advisor to Jimmy Carter. After the end of the Cold War, this was his quote: "China is unfinished business." What does China is unfinished business mean? It means, well, we defeated the Soviet Union, Moscow. Now it's time for us to give our attentions to our friends in Beijing, our rivals, actually. You know, after the Cold War, everybody's a friend. Almost everybody's called a friend, but it's really about rivalries. And I premised my when I was talking about the Arab Spring, I said we should look at the Arab Spring in the context of competing capitalist blocs. And I talked about Syria, where you see the Syrian government, Dr. Bashar al-Assad, being supported by China, Russia, Iran, as well as progressive Latin American countries and some countries in the post-Soviet space, and local movements in the Middle East. But on the other side, you see the United States, NATO, which I'm going to talk about, Turkey, also a NATO member, one of NATO's members, not a founding member, but a member down the road, joined same year as Greece. And you see the most dictatorial regimes in the world, some of the most dictatorial regimes. So Saudi Arabia, the Arab Petro Sheikhdom of Qatar, officially the Emirate of Qatar, the Kingdom of Bahrain, the United Arab Emirate. So you see this divide in the world. Competing capitalist blocs. Please keep that in mind. What is the United States trying to do? Well, it wants to remain the center of global power, with primacy. It wants to be the primal state in the world, the primate of the world. Okay, primate. No, I'm using primate in the sense that it should be used. The first state. You know, that's why it's been complained that the United States tries to impose its domestic laws. You know, Vladimir Putin and many other leaders in the world are saying, why are domestic laws of the United States imposed on the rest of the world? Well, this is part of that framework. So the United States is trying to prevent the creation of a new Silk Road. What is a new Silk Road? This new Silk Road involves something called Eurasian integration. Some of you might have heard of the Eurasian Union, which Ukraine was discussing to join. You know, and I'm going to be throwing a lot of things that are from the other discussions, because I'm going to bring up a term from Lukács, totality. We're seeing bits and pieces. Oh, we see something in Palestine. We see tensions with Iran. We see fighting in Syria. We see the government in you see President Kirchner in Argentina saying the United States wants to overthrow me. We see all these things, and they look very separate, but they're actually very tied to one another. And before I talk about NATO, I'm going to go through this. While the United States is trying to disrupt and prevent any rivals, capitalist rivals, or any alternatives to the order that it's part of, and the Washington Consensus, the dying Washington Consensus, I might add. So it's trying to prevent a new Silk Road from being formed. That's why it's in the Middle East. You know, the Middle East is, a lot of this has to do with China. Syria, a lot of it has to do with China. What is to the east of Syria is some of the world's largest natural gas reserves. Argentina has the second largest recoverable shale gas reserves in the entire world. And you know who signed the deal to recover them with the Argentine government? Gazprom in Russia. You know, there's a lot of things. That's why the vulture funds are really, as Ms. Kirchner says, President Kirchner, they're the eagles of empire. They're the eagles of empire. Those aren't my words. Those are the leaders. That's the president of Argentina's words. So there is a resource war. Ukraine also, second largest, Poland and Ukraine, second and third, no, first and third largest recoverable shale gas reserves in the world. Europe, if you exclude the Russian Federation. So a lot of this stuff is tied. And NATO essentially is the arm of the United States. But before I go to that, I'd like to talk about what happened after the end of the Cold War. Well, U.S. Undersecretary of Defense at the time, or Assistant Paul Wolfowitz, said that we need to take this time, the opportunity to get rid of old Soviet clients, okay? He said we need to get rid of old Soviet clients / allies. What did he mean by this? Is regime change in places like Damascus, in Tripoli, before the next superpower arises. He never said who the next superpower is, but my colleague before me was alluding to who's taking over. So this has a lot to do with China, and that's where NATO comes into the picture. As I said, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was formed in 1949, a few years before the Warsaw Pact was formed in 1955. It kind of points out who the real threat is. You know, if the Warsaw Pact was made by the Soviets after NATO was created, I mean, to say there's a Soviet threat, it challenges that a bit. I want to point out when the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was made, it was in reality the post-World War II occupation of Europe by the United States. You have to remember, after World War II, there was American troops in places like Italy, the bases in Britain. Obviously, Germany, as we know, was divided into 4 sectors. One of them belonged to the United States. They were also in Austria. So American troops were there, and that was a way to keep American troops from staying. And why did they want American troops to stay in Western Europe? Well, the reason was because after World War II, there was a very likely chance, well, it was very well known and it's very well documented, that the communists, socialists, certain progressive movements, whether you like them or not, they were the ones that were going to come into office. In fact, after World War II, the governments in Western Europe, many of them were coalition governments that included these forces, and with American pressure, they were excluded. The Eastern Bloc was the same thing. There was many non-communists, non-socialists involved, but they were also pushed out. You see a hardening of the lines of what Churchill dubs the Iron Curtain. But the strategy of the United States in geopolitical terms using NATO was to encircle an area that's referred to as the Eurasian heartland, the heartland. I call it the Eurasian heartland. From the west, they used NATO, but NATO was not alone. It had 2 other sister alliances. I call them sister alliances because they are NATO-like alliances. One of them was the Middle East Treaty Organization, which included several NATO members. Britain, Turkey were included. The other members were Iraq, the Hashemite monarchy of Iraq. It was a Hashemite monarchy. The relatives of the current Hashemite king of Jordan were in charge of Iraq at the time. It also included Iran, which was a monarchy at the time. And in fact, since I mentioned Iran, Iran was also a candidate to join NATO, alongside Turkey at the very start, Ireland and Austria. But because of several factors, they didn't include these countries at the start, including Greece. Later, Turkey and Greece are included. Ireland never joins, and Iran never joins, but it does become part of the Middle East Treaty Organization, which is renamed later. The Baghdad Pact is renamed to CENTO once Iraq leaves after a revolution. And then there was one more treaty, military alliance that the United States formed. It was called SEATO, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. It also included NATO members. France was a member, the United States was a member, Britain was a member, Australia, which is not a NATO member, was a member. It included Thailand, the Philippines, Pakistan as well. So there's a bridge here. You have some members, you have members from all 3 alliances within these organizations, and they're all tied to the United States. Because of the Sino-Soviet split, the problems between Moscow and Beijing, SEATO, one of the reasons that it was dismantled was because of this. It became defunct. The United States, since there was tensions between China, didn't see a reason why it should keep SEATO. But I want to point out that when these organizations were made, on the sides, there was also economic, political organizations connected to them. For Sito's case, it was the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. In NATO's case, there was the European Community, which eventually turns into the European Union. And you can always see that NATO expansion in Europe is followed by EU expansion. It's never EU expansion then NATO expansion. It's always been NATO goes there first, and then the European Union. And what does this show? It shows that spreading, I will quote Brzezinski, paraphrase Brzezinski, I won't quote him. He says that our influence in Eurasia, that's Europe and Asia, really one continent. It's fake. They're not separate continents. They're one continent, Europe and Asia. He said that our influence there spreads with the expansion of the European Union and what he calls our bridge in the western periphery of Eurasia. So that's countries like Britain, France, more specifically Germany and France. But he says using, and there is cleavages. There's problems. There's problems between some of these allies. The French were very independent at the start, less so now, less and less so by the years. That's one of the, in fact, de Gaulle accused the Americans of treachery. That's why the French went for the nuclear bomb. The Americans refused to share it. He asked for Anglo-Franco-American directorate, which the U.S. refused. But I'm sorry for jumping. We can see that the EU expansion and NATO expansion are linked. What is being expanded? It's an area that's referred to as the Euro-Atlantic zone. I always have to emphasize this. This is deceptive language. It's a camouflage to hide the word Euro, United States. This is the influence of the United States in Europe and in Eurasia. They use the word Euro-Atlantic to hide the American influence. And they're opposed to Eurasian integration, which means Euro-Asia, Europe and Asia, specifically Russia. Russia is the primal Eurasian state, both Europe and Asia. Excellent candidate for bringing the two areas together. So the Euro-Atlantic area is being expanded militarily. At the same time as there's tensions in Ukraine, there are negotiations in Washington and Brussels for the equivalent, much stronger equivalent of NAFTA between European Union and the United States. So that there is a transatlantic or Euro-Atlantic free trade agreement that's being negotiated. The United States is deliberately using the tensions in Ukraine to get as much concessions from the European Union as possible. And in fact, the sanctions that the European Union is imposing on Russia are hurting the European Union. Everybody here knows that. They don't need to hear that from me. But the United States has pressured this on them. One of the reasons is because the United States plans on being a major shale natural gas exporter in the world because of fracking. You know, the State Department has very aggressively and very proactively held seminars to support the American fracking industry in shale gas. And the United States, that's why the EU is sanctioning Russia. You know, the Americans can't compete against Russian natural gas. The prices are much cheaper. First of all, it doesn't take anything to transport them. It's not fracked. There's not huge expenses in bringing them out of the ground. But what do you do when your rivals, when your capitalist rivals have better prices than you? It's never been a free market. What you do is you basically use politicking, and you get the buyers, the markets to sanction the energy source, which is Russia, so you can sell your more expensive gas. And what do you do so the price of your gas doesn't go up? Because you have to remember, it costs a lot to start up companies and to frack. What do? You disrupt other countries that might sell gas, like Argentina. NATO is the arm of the United States. We can see it now active in every continent in the world. That includes South America. Colombia is now what you call a global partner. El Salvador, under the previous Arena government, was sending troops to NATO engagements. The United States and NATO have both started pushing their naval forces towards the South Atlantic. In fact, the governments of Argentina and Brazil protested about this because it's been reactivated because of the intensifying capitalist rivalries in the world. They've reactivated their naval forces there. They're in Africa. One of their largest peacekeeping forces, so-called peacekeeping forces, was in Sudan. They're in Somalia. the African Union has actually uh, um, um, been turned into, in the level of peacekeeping, arms, soldiers, it's been turned into a subordinate of NATO. In fact, African Union security policies are dictated by the European United States. They have taxing missions in Africa. There was in 2001, there was Operation Endeavor into the Eastern Mediterranean, permanent NATO force. We see them in Afghanistan still many years now. They've established a commission with Afghanistan and Pakistan. Australia, New Zealand, Mongolia, South Korea, Japan, Singapore, Iraq. These are all now NATO partners in one way or another. They're all NATO they're not members of NATO. They're NATO partners on military cooperation. And one of the reasons that these programs for military cooperation have been established is because the United States wants to reestablish what it lost during the Cold War. Remember I said NATO had two sister organizations, CETO and CENTO? Well, because they're gone, it's trying to expand NATO through partnerships. And that's encircling China through these, it's trying to encircle China through these partnerships, NATO partnerships with these countries. The remilitarization of Japan, which, you know, it's been years in the making. This isn't news. The Japanese are remilitarizing. They call it self-defense forces. But this is a way to get around constitutional technicalities. Not only that, in the Mediterranean, there's the Mediterranean Dialogue, which was created many years ago. It's one of the oldest cooperation agreements. Sorry, off the top of my head, I don't remember the year. But this is also being paralleled. Like I said, EU expansion and NATO expansion go hand in hand. Well, there's also, the European Union has something called the Euro-Mediterranean Partnership. It's called the Union for the Mediterranean now. Sarkozy renamed it. It also is called the Barcelona process. This is the political economic layer of this military project. The European Union is deeply involved in it. So is the Eastern Partnership, the European Union's Eastern Partnership, which targets Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus, even when some of these countries don't want to be a part of it. The Republic of Azerbaijan in the Caucasus, Armenia in the Caucasus, and the Republic of Georgia. The Eastern Partnership here, the equivalent for it would be the Partnership for Peace. So we can see that there's military expansion is made to assist political and economic objectives of expansion. And ultimately, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and the threats it's imposing on other parts of the world, and it is a threat, are made and geared specifically to help keep the United States, try to keep the United States as a primate in the world. And to keep it as a primate in the world now, we can see its allies are increasingly being turned into vassals, and these vassals are always contributing troops because the imperial center doesn't have the manpower anymore or the resources. So that's why it's pushing the rest of it's pushing the rest of NATO's members to increase their defense spending, to buy American weapons, and to contribute troops as tribute to the empire's campaigns. There are intensifying capitalist rivalries. What does every capitalist want? A monopoly of the markets. What is this monopoly tied to? Well, there's a security agenda. So governments that are working for the capitalist structure let me rephrase this. There is an international push within various societies towards totalitarianism. This might sound alarmist, but all you need to do is look at home. You know, there's in in the name of fighting terrorism, we're going to have increased surveillance and detainment. The government's been very intellectually dishonest about what's happened, trying to connect what's happened in. I come from Ottawa. Connect what happened in Ottawa with what's happening in the Middle East, and using that as a pretext to push a security agenda that it already had planned. It announced at the United Nations, a copy paste actually what the British are trying to do, talking about things like revoking citizenship, things that will take certain rights away from people and be detained, thought policing essentially. It might sound alarmist, but this is a direction that this international rivalry is pushing countries into, and ours is, this country here is one of them. Multiculturalism is actually under threat. I talk about Brzezinski quickly. He said that as countries, societies like North American societies, because they're becoming more diverse and multicultural, there's more of a push against war. So, for example, everybody in in North America was very involved and looked at Europe because majority of the population in North America are European. They were very concerned about the wars, World War I and World War II. The issue of Japan was very different, because they were not Europeans. And this is why you see terms now being used to describe Canadians as Canadian-born. That's very deceptive language. When you talk about the recent attacker in Ottawa, he's been called Canadian-born. It means he's not a Canadian. He's just born here. You are taking that person's identity away, and we have a history of detentions here and detainment in this country. We're very blind. A lot of people are blind to it, but we have a very long-standing history of doing that, and it's tied to that. And this is why Monsieur Sarkozy in France and Mr. Cameron in Britain both declared in the same year, back-to-back, that multiculturalism is dead in their countries. And it's because foreign policy or their objectives can't be pushed forward with multiculturalism at all. So these are some things that I think inside societies we need to look at. Addressing this, this has been a theme that's consistent. Two things have been brought up. Oil. I just want to say that if oil stays below $80 a barrel, it's going to have serious consequences for the global economy. Venezuela called for an emergency session of OPEC, Saudi Arabia. Someone said that the United States made a deal with Saudi Arabia. This would also hurt the United States. I mean, this is only something that can be done short term, cannot be done. Flushing the market with oil to bring the prices down will not benefit the United States. They have their own oil producers, and they need the price of oil to be high to sell their gas. Otherwise, the entire gas industry there is going to collapse. So, that's a short-term thing. Of course, it does hurt Russia. It does hurt Venezuela. It does hurt Iran. It benefits China. There's contradictions here, but. This is very heavily politicized, and it's used. It's used sometimes in nefarious ways against countries like environmental issues, like countries like Ecuador. They complain that we can't develop. There's a concept anthropologists have. It's called ecological natives. I think some people at least here should know what it is, and it's a concept that basically tries to develop people from developing their own resources. And the greenhouse gas emissions is being used in economic rivalries. So that's something that we should be aware of. And there's also politics of scarcity as well. In connection to environmental issues, where certain things are pronounced to be scarce to make prices go up. And ecological movements and people who care about the environment should be aware of that. That's not.
Right. Well, we are very close to elections, and on elections day, uh, practicing this representative democracy, what we do is we go to the ballot box, and we basically legally authorize a few people to make all the legislation for us. In other words, on election day, what we do is actually we divest ourselves from the responsibility of making political decisions. So we call that democracy. In fact, it's giving up of democracy.
Yeah.
It's endorsing our power to somebody
if,
else.
If our the people we elect, and as you say, we're having a city election, very, very soon, but it's the same provincially and it's the same federally. We spend 2 minutes in a box putting an X on a piece of paper, and then for some reason, the people we elect seem to think they work for somebody else, and they completely ignore us.
That's right. So that's one of the concerns that we have with representative democracy, and that politicians will tell you that, oh, they're going to do this and they're going to do that. They choose a lot of words that will make us believe that they're in fact representing us. When in fact, once they get elected, they have their own agenda, which is not necessarily the same that they were given to us, the voters. They not only have their own agenda, but also they are dependent on the sponsors of their electoral campaign. So if the Chamber of Commerce or some big business sponsors them, gives them money, they're going to have to please and work for those sponsors, otherwise they won't get the money next time around. So that's one issue. The other issue is with parties. If you talk to some politicians, they will say, I wish I could do that, but our party line is not, we don't have that in our agenda, the party's agenda.
And it's not that you go to a politician and ask him for something, but if, let's say, in the area the politician represents, if 70% of the people want something, whatever that is, then that is supposed to be that politician's job, is to represent that. But they just say, sorry, I can't do it, and they won't do it. So
and they will also tell you that most people want something different, not what you're saying, but there is no accountability of it. So it's just they fabricate that, they create that result and say most people want a bridge here, most people want a highway here, and say, where do you get that idea? Well, I talk to people, so they choose their sources. So the computer technology has actually changed the possibilities for people to participate. So if we have these new possibilities, then direct democracy through referendum and plebiscites is possible.
So what you would like to see is direct democracy, where on issues the public, the citizens vote, and therefore everybody knows what people want, and when the majority wants this, the politicians will do this.
Yeah.